All right, everyone, this PowerPoint is on the phosphorus and sulfur cycles. So this is topic 1.6. The learning objective, explain the steps and reservoir interactions of the phosphorus cycle. You will notice that there is not a learning objective for the sulfur cycle. However, you do see some questions regarding the sulfur cycle, especially where it has to do with burning of fossil fuels, predominantly coal. So we're going to discuss the sulfur cycle as well. But starting with the phosphorus cycle, there's only two pieces of vocab. The first is phosphate. This is PO4 with a 3- charge, and this is phosphorus that's in a bioavailable form. Where you find phosphorus mostly in living organisms is DNA and RNA, so your nucleic acids, ATP, which is a very close cousin of AMP, adenosine monophosphate, also known as the nitrogenous base adenine. And then phospholipids. So the phospholipid bilayer that makes up every living cell and the subcellular membranes of organelles. So the phosphorus cycle is notable in that it is the only cycle that we'll talk about that does not have an atmospheric stage. So you do not see phosphorus in the air. Okay, so we're going to start with rocks that contain phosphate. Those rocks will weather and erode. And as they weather and erode, they will form soil. Okay, so a lot of phosphorus is found in the soil. That's really what we're seeing over here. All right, but from that soil, from that rock, it can erode into the water. And that's where we're going to start with this cycle. So you have dissolved phosphates. Those dissolved phosphates can be taken up by any producers in the food chain. So we're talking about algae, we're talking about plants, phytoplankton, and photosynthetic bacteria. The phosphates will then move up the food chain, so the little fish will eat the algae, the big fish will eat the little fish, and they will get their phosphates from their diet. Okay, phosphates will be excreted out of these organisms and go back into the waterway, be available for decomposers. Everything will die, so the animals and the algae will die, and they will decompose, and that decomposition will release those phosphates back into the water. So go back to dissolved phosphates. All right, and then you just complete that cycle over and over again. Living things live, they excrete waste, they die, and then that phosphate gets returned. But the phosphates can get trapped in marine sediments. So as successive layers of organic matter settle to the ocean floor or the lake bottom, they can get covered with sediment, and that phosphorus from living things can get trapped in that sediment and eventually form phosphate rocks, which can uplift due to tectonic activity over geologic time and then erode out once more. Okay, so that completes the cycle. On land, we're looking at the soil. So we have phosphates in the soil. They get taken up by plants. They get eaten by animals, which get eaten by other animals, which get eaten by other animals, etc. And the phosphates move up the food chain. You have animal waste. So those animals are going to excrete waste, and that's going to contain phosphates in it, any excess phosphates. And again, those plants and animals are going to die, and that waste is going to decompose, and all of that is going to return those phosphates back to the soil. So that forms a closed cycle as well. Right. And where humans add phosphates to the system is by mining. So there are these phosphate rocks, and we find them and we mine them, and we turn them into fertilizer. That fertilizer we spray on our crops, and if it runs off of that agricultural field, it can dump a huge amount of phosphates into a body of water in a very short period of time and lead to cultural eutrophication, just like you could with nitrogen fertilizers. Animal waste does the same thing. It can say that you have a feedlot or a pig pen right next to a creek, and there's a heavy rain event, and all of that animal waste gets washed straight into that creek. It can lead to eutrophication also, just like we talked about with the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so I think that the phosphorus cycle is probably the simplest cycle. You have phosphate in the rocks, it weathers out, it erodes, it gets taken up by producers, goes up the food chain, and then back to dissolve phosphates or phosphates in the soil through decomposition, and then continue that cycle until it gets settled in sediments and then uplifted into mountains again. But again, the primary human impact on the phosphorus cycle is the use of fertilizer. So we mine fertilizer, we mine these phosphorus-rich rocks, and we mine other things such as bat guano and bird guano that are high in both nitrates and phosphates. Animal waste as well, so whether that's raw sewage or whether that is waste from our agricultural activities, all of that can lead to cultural eutrophication from phosphates in the water. And I'm not going to go through the entire process of eutrophication again because we just went over that in the nitrogen cycle PowerPoint, so revisit that PowerPoint to refresh yourself on eutrophication. So that's it for the phosphorus cycle. Like I said, I think the phosphorus cycle is the easiest cycle that we have to know. It doesn't have an atmospheric stage, and it's either soil, water, or living things. All right. The next one is the sulfur cycle, and like I said, the sulfur cycle does not have a specific learning objective tied to it, but you may see questions regarding the sulfur cycle, especially as it relates to mining or fossil fuel combustion, most notably coal. All right, so let's talk about it. The main reservoir of sulfur on the planet is in the rock, which isn't shown too much here, but it's in the rock. Okay, pyrite is one of those rocks. Pyrite is Fe so iron, one atom of iron, one atom of sulfur. All right, so FeS. It's also known as fool's gold, and fool's gold is often an impurity in coal. So when you burn that coal, you are also burning the sulfur along with it. And our human emissions are releasing hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide can go through a couple steps and eventually form sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide can also react with water and form sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. That sulfuric acid is an acid, it's a strong acid, and it can precipitate out. It falls as acid rain. All right, so that acid rain is obviously lowering the pH of that rainwater and the acidity, or the acid, the hydrogen ions rather, and that rainwater can weather rock. Okay, so it can lead to weathering and subsequently erosion. It can also change the water chemistry of lakes and rivers, as well as the chemistry of the soil. Even though it precipitates out into the ocean and all rivers eventually lead to the ocean, it doesn't really change the pH of the ocean too much because there is just so much water in the ocean. The volume is so high that even adding a little bit of a strong acid doesn't really change it too much. There is actually sulfates in the ocean system anyway. Those sulfates are necessary for life. Sulfur is found in a few amino acids, just a handful of amino acids, but that means that sulfur is important for life because it is in many proteins. Okay, so it's available in the soil and it's available in the water in the form of sulfates. All right, those sulfates in the soil, some microbes can decompose those or break those down and turn them into hydrogen sulfide, which can go up into the atmosphere. Volcanic eruptions can release hydrogen sulfide or sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and they will also contribute to that sulfuric acid, which can precipitate out. All right. So the main point of the sulfur cycle is that humans can impact it by burning fossil fuels, most notably coal, releasing H2S and SO2 into the atmosphere, which form sulfuric acid, which can precipitate out as acid rain. Right, and that's basically what's stated here. So human activity, especially burning coal and diesel fuel, can release these two gases into the atmosphere, which can form sulfuric acid, which is one of our two forms of acid rain, or at least one of the most common forms of acid rain. The other being nitric acid and then also carbonic acid. All right, naturally released by rock and volcanism, but it's currently being released at what we think is an unprecedented rate. All right, so we are seeing more sulfur dioxide and more hydrogen sulfide in the atmosphere than is what we would consider normal. All right, we can also release sulfates or just elemental sulfur into waterways through the mining of coal, and then you have mining runoff, or from washing of coal, because coal has to be washed before it's used, or just storing coal in any way. And the major contributor of that is, like I said, pyrite, which is fool's gold. So here you see a lump of coal with a bit of pyrite in it. There is one final cycle that we'll talk about this year, which is the mercury cycle, but we won't talk about it now. We'll talk about it when we get to pollution. So just want that on your radar. And let's get back to the learning objective. So the phosphorus cycle, explain the steps and reservoir interactions in the phosphorus cycle, again, in the rock, in the water, in the soil, and in living things. The phosphorus cycle is the movement of atoms and molecules containing the element phosphorus between sources and sinks. The major reservoirs of the phosphorus cycle are rock and sediments that contain phosphorus-bearing minerals, which primarily are phosphates, all right, especially for this class. There is no atmospheric component to the phosphorus cycle, so it's the only one that we'll talk about that does not have an atmospheric component, and you may see questions like that regarding that. All right. The limitations this imposes on the return of phosphorus from the ocean and land make phosphorus naturally scarce in aquatic and many terrestrial ecosystems. It all relies on the weathering and erosion of rock. So it is typically your limiting nutrient. Like we'll talk about when we get to agriculture, phosphorus is typically, or phosphates are typically your limiting nutrients. All right. So the limiting factor in many biological systems. Okay. Sulfur cycle as well. Again, you don't need to worry about it too much except where it relates to coal. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about mining and when we talk about atmospheric and aquatic pollution. Anyway, I hope you guys learned something. Have a great day. I'll see you all in class.